Here we're going to look at example 2, choosing a solution method. We're told to solve the equation 6x squared minus 7x minus 20 equals 0 using two different methods. So I'm going to use the quadratic formula and factoring by grouping. Remember that the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So 6x squared minus 7x minus 20, a would be equal to 6, b is equal to negative 7, and c is equal to negative 20. Remember that the quadratic formula always works. All right? It's not always pretty, but it will always work out. A lot of times it does get rather messy and kind of convoluted, but if we're careful and we do everything that we're supposed to, we will get the answer correct. So I've plugged in each of my terms here. So I have a, b is negative 7. We just want to check these and make sure that I actually plug the right numbers in, and negative 20. All right, so we'll continue from there. So x is equal to, this become a positive 7. Negative 7 squared would be 49. And then here we have negative 4 times 6 times negative 20. And that's going to be 480. And that'll be a positive 480. Remember, be careful with your signs there. 2 times 6 would be 12. So just keep going right along. 49 plus 480 is 529. 529 just so happens to be a perfect square. And the square root of 529 is 23. You might not know that off the top of your head, but you can always check on the calculator. If it's not a perfect square, you would need to check to see if you could break that down. Now, this is one of the problems where you do need to split this up. We don't have a radical anymore, so I do need to split this into x equals 7 plus 23 over 12 and x equals 7 minus 23 over 12. Because I need to solve these individually because they can be simplified. So x is equal to 30 over 12, and if I was to reduce that, that would become 5 over 2. And then here, 7 minus 23 would be negative 16 over 12, and that would reduce to negative 4 over 3. All right, and those are our two solutions. This one wasn't too bad. There is always the risk of making mistakes within the radicals and substituting, but overall, not the worst problem we've seen. Now, factoring by grouping, really, it's also the AC method in this case. So I have 6x squared minus 7x minus 20. And what I'm going to need is, I'm going to need to do 6 times negative 20. And I need factors of 120 that have a sum, in this case, of negative 7. Now, there's a lot of factors in negative 120. I'm going to jump through a couple of them, but I'll save some time here. So you'd have things like 1 in 120, the larger number being negative because the sum is negative. 2 in 60, or negative 60, clearly that's not going to work. You'd have to keep going until you figure out what does work. 3 and negative 40, 4 and negative 30, 5 and, what's going on here? Can't think. 5, 2, 24, there we go. Then you'd have 6 and negative 20, 7 doesn't work, 8 works. So 8 would be 8 and negative 15, which gives us the negative 7 that we're looking for. Sometimes you get to that quicker, sometimes you don't. But either way, we're going to take that number, these 8 and negative 15, and that's going to replace the negative 7. If you don't really remember the AC method, you can go look up the video on how to do that, and I explain this in more detail. Now we'll look at factoring by grouping. My first two terms, 6x squared plus 8x, I'm going to factor a 2x out, and I am left with 3x plus 4. So that comes from, let's highlight these. These two would factor into that. And then the negative 15x squared will factor here. So I'm going to factor out a negative 5, and I'm left with 3x plus 4. That'd be equal to 0. And then I can rewrite this as 3x plus 4 times 2x minus 5. And now if you remember the zero product property, that tells me that I can set each one of these pieces or these binomials equal to 0. And then solve for x. So I get x is equal to negative 4 over 3. And then over here, I would just do the same thing by solving for x. Well, with different numbers, but same idea. And x is equal to 5 over 2, or 5 halves. And you'll see that my solutions are the same. Right? I just used two different methods. The factoring by grouping is a little neater, or sometimes will be less steps and much easier, especially if you have a really simple problem. Maybe you have something like x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0, and you can very easily factor this into x plus 2 and x plus 3, and then you can solve that. However, they're not always going to be that easy. I would definitely factor this one over using the quadratic formula. However, the quadratic formula always works. Factoring is only going to work if the problem can be factored. All right, so if you can't factor it, you can't use the factoring method to get your answer. So it's really important that you know how to use the quadratic formula. A lot of times it's always a nice fail-safe, something you can just go back to if you can't figure out how to factor a problem, or maybe it's just not factorable. All right, even this one, finding factors of 120 or negative 120 that added up to negative 7, sometimes that might take a while. All right, depending on how many factors there are, it could take time. And if you miss one of them, then you're just going to wind up wasting a lot of time trying to factor a problem if you missed the factors which happen to be the right answer. So the quadratic formula you can always rely on. Again, it can get a little tricky at times. You may have some complex numbers thrown in there, but again, I'll say it for like the 25th time, the quadratic formula always works. Okay, so if you want to use that as a very reliable method, I'd recommend that you get quite familiar with it.